Hello, Eternal Life fans. Welcome to an interview with Gennady Stolyarov II, author of Death is Wrong, the chairman of the Transhumanist Party, and editor-in-chief of the Rational Argumentator.
That's right.
Wow, we're in for a treat. I've interviewed him before. I'll include those old interviews in the description here. But let's start off with what are some updates with the Transhumanist Party? What's new? Give me something that maybe you've never told any other person that's interviewed you. He's been interviewed a lot of times.
Yes. Well, first I will tell you of a development that I think many within the transhumanist community are aware, but this is important for the broader public. And that is the conclusion of the U.S. Transhumanist Party primary election for our nominee for President of the United States, who is Johannon Ben Zion. He won on a longevity platform. So his campaign slogan is "Radical life extension is closer than you think." And by you, I think he means the broader public. I think the Eternal Life fans understand the possibilities for attaining radical life extension within our lifetimes, but he's trying to spread that message to the population at large. And this is quite encouraging because he has some innovative ideas for how to garner publicity. So in early 2020, he is planning to set a world record for continuous immersion in virtual reality or augmented reality. And during that time, he's going to broadcast essentially virtual meetings with various intellectual luminaries discussing these subjects, discussing life extension, discussing a techno-futurist policy framework, and how those can be applied in the nearer term within the context of American politics.
Wow, how's he going to avoid the motion sickness? I was doing the virtual reality and it was like getting motion sickness. So he's got a challenge right there.
I think he's going to have a controlled environment, and he's going to have people monitoring his condition. There are going to be some medical professionals who are available to give advice and inform him on what to avoid, what signs to watch out for. So this is going to be a highly planned experiment. He has approached the people at the Guinness Book of World Records, so he's going to try to set it up so that there's a possibility of qualifying for the official world record. And the key is this is going to attract attention, not just in terms of how the technology of virtual reality is becoming more accessible, but also in terms of other emerging technologies that he's going to be discussing during this experiment. And if it attracts journalists, if it attracts commentators who write about it, who maybe broadcast snippets of it, this is going to broaden the awareness of the transhumanist movement, and he can then articulate his message that radical life extension is closer than you think. It is a tactic that's reminiscent of Zoltan Istvan's immortality bus when Zoltan ran for president in 2016, because once again it's something that is very distinctive, very noticeable. We don't want to repeat the idea of a coffin-shaped bus driving across the country because that has already been done. But we want to do something that has the potential to garner a similar impact.
Media attention, that's the key. Have you got to try the virtual reality yet?
I have only had the opportunity to try some of those very basic phone apps where one attaches a device to one's phone, and then it's essentially a slideshow at that point. I haven't yet used an Oculus Rift or even a HoloLens, primarily because the consumer versions are not that accessible yet. Most of the deployment of these devices has been in industrial settings where based on what the people involved with that kind of work tell me, they have made a significant difference. So, for instance, if a worker in a factory is wearing a HoloLens and there's some device that he needs to maintain or check up on, that HoloLens can actually report live metrics from that device. And maybe the worker doesn't need to open the hood of that device to look underneath because he sees the data already.
The device attaching to your phone, are you talking about the ones where you put on the headset and then slide your phone in right in front of your eyes?
Yes.
I tried the same thing.
Yes.
It's pretty cool.
And it is indeed an advancement over what came before. I think the big bottleneck right now is phone battery life, because that is still
drains
woefully
the battery.
insufficient.
You need to be plugged in while you're doing it almost.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And
the phone gets really hot, I noticed. It really overheats
Yes.
the phone.
yes, it does. So this is one technical challenge that I think it is imperative to solve. How do we greatly increase battery longevity? How do we store power more reliably so that we don't have to charge devices pretty much continuously? And this also, of course, has implications for electrical vehicles. Electrically powered vehicles right now have range as their primary limitation, and the range is improving, as is consumer acceptance. But it would still not be nice. It would still be nice not to spend an hour charging the vehicle.
Yes. All right, now here's an interesting question. Excluding all the transhumanist political candidates, which presidential candidate that you know of do you think would be best for our eternal life, to increase our chances of living forever?
Well, there's an easy answer to that, because this candidate is not running as a transhumanist this time. He's running as a Republican, Zoltan Istvan.
All right. Okay.
So he is challenging Trump in the Republican primaries,
Right.
and he has actually made it onto the ballot in a number of states. So I think this is a salutary development. He is attempting to influence a different demographic
Right.
with the transhumanist message. He decided not to run on behalf of the Transhumanist Party, but there is an interesting opening within the Republican primaries, because we don't know what is going to happen with Donald Trump. Probably he's not going to be removed from office, but there's a small possibility that he will be, if there is some additional information that is released that might convince the Republican senators to convict him. And if that happens, essentially all bets are off in terms of what takes place in American politics, who gets the Republican nomination at that point.
Okay, so other than Zoltan Istvan, what would be your second choice for the candidate you think would be most likely to help us live forever, that would not be a transhumanist?
It would not be a transhumanist. Andrew Yang is most likely the closest. I don't think he identifies explicitly as a transhumanist, though he is marginally aware of the term because some transhumanists have exposed him to it, and he has some sympathies to it. I think his platform of universal basic income and greater use of technology in educational systems, in governance, would be transhumanist friendly.
Absolutely, he's super into the technology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Ben Zion is taking a lot of Yang's ideas and extending them further. So Ben Zion is also an advocate of universal basic income, but he believes that it would be possible to give each American an unconditional basic income of $52,000 a year. That's in addition to any other income that that person would receive, through an idea that Zoltan originally proposed, which is the federal land dividend. So with the federal land dividend, the U.S. government would lease the majority of currently unoccupied federal land, with the exception of national parks, various notable landmarks. But for land that is unremarkable, that land could be put to commercial use, and there could be some conditions, some environmental stipulations, but the revenue from that would be in the many trillions of dollars.
It sure would be fun to have an extra $52,000 a year. You could buy a lot of supplements with that. You could afford a lot of stuff. Wow. What would you do with the extra $52,000 a year?
Well, that's an interesting question, Rowan. I would probably use a significant portion of that money to donate to projects for life extension research. Lifespan.io runs various crowdfunding campaigns from time to time, and I've contributed some money to them. I've donated to the SENS Research Foundation before, but there would be some higher impact donations that I would be able to arrange. And I would also host more events that spread the ideas of life extension. With that kind of additional money, it would be fairly easy to rent conference space, for instance, and purchase the supplies for more in-person events where, in addition to inviting guests from the transhumanist community, we could invite journalists and other members of the public, and they could cover those events and spread the word.
I might save up for an underground bunker. Wow. Where do you think is the safest place to live for someone who wants to live forever? Is there a safe? Have you ever thought about what's the safest location on Earth?
Well, Nevada is actually fairly safe in terms of the kinds of natural disasters that could happen here. So there are some risks here. There's wildfire risk in Nevada, but it's, I would say, about an order of magnitude lower than in many of the surrounding states. Certainly when you look at California, where tens of thousands of homes have been burned to the ground by these mega wildfires, you compare that to Nevada, where the most destructive wildfires over the course of the past decade burned about 30 homes each.
Mm-hmm.
There is an immense difference. Nevada does not get hurricanes. Nevada does not get many destructive tornadoes. Occasionally a small tornado will run through central Nevada, but it's not really a significant risk. Nevada does have some winter storms. Nevada does get inundated by smoke from the California wildfires on occasion, which is not healthy to be in, but the extent of the damage pales in comparison to what one would experience actually living in California, being directly exposed to those wildfires. Nevada has a certain degree of earthquake risk. Generally speaking, the risk is of a more severe, higher magnitude earthquake, particularly in western Nevada. But fortunately, thus far, the only casualty from an earthquake in Nevada history was a person in southern Nevada who was actually killed because of the impact of an earthquake near Los Angeles.
Oh, so, wow.
Again, mortality from earthquakes in Nevada has been minimal. And of course, the United States is not being invaded right now. If you live in a low crime area of the US, you're fairly safe, statistically speaking. Now, unfortunately, anywhere you live in this day and age, you're not going to be 100% safe. There will always be some risk of accidents, some risk of crime, some risk of natural disasters. I've also seen a map of the United States with areas of catastrophe risk overlaid on top of one another. And that map doesn't have all catastrophe risks, but it does have earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, and floods. So in Nevada, mostly on that map, there would just be earthquake risk.
Right.
In the Four Corners area, interestingly enough, there's a kind of white space there. So I am thinking it may be a prudent idea to build a megacity in the Four Corners area.
Nice idea. All right. So, somebody said there's a bunch of radiation here in Nevada. Have you heard that? Because they're used to nuclear testing. Is that true?
There is a nuclear test site in southern Nevada. And there has even been some nuclear testing done in northern Nevada, not in Carson City or Reno proper, but farther to the east, so in less inhabited areas around Sand Mountain. But it's not the case that the fallout from that nuclear testing would reach the populated areas of Nevada today. So if you live in Carson City or Washoe County or Clark County, you're pretty safe from that.
All right, that's good to know. What do you think, now we're going to switch gears in a different sort of topic. What do you think is the best strategy to get more religious people into transhumanism? Because religious people, they often have this idea of the afterlife, and in the transhumanist circles, it's talked about the conflict bit there between religious people and transhumanists who want to live forever physically, and that's what I'm promoting to my audience, is let's live forever physically. But how do you solve this conflict?
I think that's a good question, and I don't believe there's an inherent conflict between religion and transhumanism. I think it's more an issue of the personal mindset of any given individual who is faced with transhumanist ideas, whether that person be religious or secular, because there are some secular skeptics of transhumanism as well. And I think the common denominator of skepticism is a kind of status quo bias, an inability or refusal to believe that the future could be dramatically different from the present. A lot of people have a certain myopia. They think that the way the world is within their time frame of familiarity is the way it either has to be or inevitably is going to be. The issue with that, of course, is it's wrong from a historical perspective. There have been dramatic changes to the background conditions of everyday human life, even over the course of living memory. Someone born in the year 1930 experienced a very different world from the one we inhabit today. As the pace of change accelerates, it is going to be easier for most people to see that. But nonetheless, if people are used to something and they have any belief system that underpins their worldview, unless they are open to the possibility of fundamental change, they're going to interpret that belief system in some way to resist meaningful change. So religious systems have often been interpreted by their adherents to oppose whatever the new developments are. In the 19th century, anesthesia was decried by many as being contrary to the will of God, because ostensibly God intended people to feel pain. In the mid-20th century, a lot of people denounced open heart surgery as contrary to the will of God because it was a really extensive medical intervention. In the late 1970s, briefly, a lot of people were afraid of in vitro fertilization. And yet, once they saw that the first IVF babies that were born were just normal human beings, they lived normal lives, they came to accept it. For the most part, religious people today are not railing against anesthesia or open heart surgery or in vitro fertilization. So that suggests to me it's not their religion per se that is the obstacle. It is how they interpret their religious views at any given point in time. So in the future, certain technologies that are just on the horizon today, gene therapies or genetic engineering or even cloning, may not be seen as being as controversial.
And wasn't it religious people who were against the stem cell therapy, which was saving lives, and
Yes, and you can make religious arguments in favor of these treatments as well. For instance, many religions have a humanitarian aspect to their theology. So if you're supposed to help the sick and help the needy, then these medical advances are certainly contributing to that. certain religions have lore, at the very least, that also supports longer lifespans. In the book of Genesis, there's a whole list of patriarchs who lived for hundreds of years. Yes, Methuselah is said to have lived for 969 years, according to the book of Genesis. Now, I'm not a religious person myself, so I don't think that actually happened, but if someone does think that actually happened, then that person should introspect and ask himself, well, if Methuselah lived for 969 years, what's inherently wrong with that? Why would it be contrary to the will of God? Right. So I don't think transhumanists should be out to deconvert anyone. I think transhumanists should be out to engage people according to the parameters of their worldview and attempt to convince them that that worldview is compatible with radical life extension and technological progress. And I don't think there's as much resistance to that inherently as some people fear. I think largely the resistance arises from the lack of familiarity and certain very specific theological interpretations. But if you can overcome those, any tactic that advances you toward that goal is welcome. So if there are movements within certain religious denominations, like the Mormon Transhumanist Association or the Christian Transhumanist Association, that are working to change people's minds, then that certainly is most welcome.
Right, there can be a merger, or should be. A quote I like to use for religious audiences, the quote of Jesus when he said, "He who keeps my saying will never see death." So it's almost like he's a transhumanist there. He's saying if you keep his saying, you'll never die. I mean, that's one interpretation of that verse. Of course, most religious people wouldn't interpret it that way. They would say, well, there he's talking about living forever in some afterlife, but you could interpret it very literally.
Mm-hmm. And some of the interpretations of Christianity that I have encountered suggest that actually Jesus's intentions were to talk about a literal physical resurrection, not just existing in some ethereal other world, but actually coming back in the body on Earth. And a lot of the Russian cosmist thinkers, like Nikolai Fyodorov, advocated for just that. He was saying it's the great common task of humankind to resurrect everybody who has ever lived. And he was a fervent Orthodox Christian.
Right. With quantum archaeology, right? That's the technology that he was talking about.
Well, at that point, when he was writing in the late 19th, early 20th century, quantum mechanics still hadn't been developed, but later philosophers essentially posited that as a possibility. We don't know, though, what future technologies are going to be developed to enable this. Some sort of record of a person's life and thoughts and memories would need to be reconstructed, and of course there's a question of whether the reconstructed person will have the continuity of identity of the original individual, but nonetheless it's definitely a worthwhile project to pursue at a much more advanced stage of technology, where I think the theoretical and practical answers to some of these questions will be more readily available. But nonetheless, people have been thinking about the possibility conceptually of resurrecting the dead. And it's not incompatible with either religious or scientific frameworks.
Right. So that's the message then. Heaven is a place on earth, right? In the future, we can make this world heaven. And something I do for people is I like to just put logic. Like, even if you believe in the afterlife and you believe in all this stuff, you can still logically, you understand that you don't know for sure. And
exactly.
So that's the argument I put forth, is like, okay, you don't know for sure, so as long as you don't know for sure there's an afterlife, why not stick around here? It's the only life we know for sure exists, right? So that's the argument I put forth.
And that's also the argument that I use in Death is Wrong. Right. We are certain of this life, We are not certain of anything else. And furthermore, most religions take extremely hostile positions towards suicide. So most religions will say it is wrong for you to intentionally shorten your own life. So then, how can there be such blithe acquiescence to any sort of upper limit on the human lifespan? Shouldn't the message still be you need to try to survive for as long as possible using whatever means are available? And then the other question I would pose to...
So you said there, it's a sin not to try to live forever physically. It's a sin. Right?
So the other question I would pose to those who would object to technological life extension is, how do you know that it's not the will of God for humans to pursue these technologies? Because clearly humans have pursued other technologies throughout the course of history, and you don't find them contrary to the will of God, so how is this so different?
Right.
Qualitatively it isn't, and I think this is what a lot of people still need to understand about transhumanism. Transhumanism isn't saying that we need to transition to some radically different form of being. Transhumanism is an essential continuation of the dynamics of human civilization, of human technological progress, what we have been pursuing for thousands of years.
Exactly. And you brought up a really good point about suicide, because it's like, if you have all these things available to us today, like the supplements and potential anti-aging therapies that are coming out and everything we could be doing right now to extend life, and if it's right there in your face and you don't take it, it's like suicidal. It's like suicide by not taking this stuff that could extend your life, So let's go on to the next question here. So within transhumanist politics, there are different kinds of transhumanist politics. Like there's the democratic transhumanists, there's the conservative ones, the libertarian. Which do you most identify with?
So the U.S. Transhumanist Party, first of all, welcomes transhumanists from all of these perspectives. But furthermore, we try to transcend these fault lines. So whatever your views on the conventional political spectrum may be, I think the key to recognize is that technology is changing the world, changing human dynamics and incentives to such an extent that a lot of these old labels are quickly becoming obsolete, in that the spectrum of available policy options now is very different from what it would have been 30 years ago or 50 years ago. So some of these old labels, they are based on certain constraints or certain elements of the world that are no longer the case. For example, this whole debate or dichotomy between libertarianism and socialism. The difference between those two ideologies is essentially, do we leave everything up to the private market and free enterprise and voluntary individual action, or do we have some people essentially getting free things from the government, but the government then has to tax the rest of the population or impose restrictions or controls? Now, there are several changes that have made it very difficult to actually sustain this dichotomy anymore. First of all, the line between the private sector and the government has been extremely blurred. We live in an era where private corporations routinely write the laws that will, in some cases, restrict their competitors and co-opt the government for certain purposes that may be contrary to the interests of other people. On the other hand, we also live in an era where some goods and services are essentially free now. For instance, if you're using the internet, you can download files for free. You can get email for free. And you may still have to pay for the internet and pay a greater amount than technically you would need in order to get the service, but that's because of bad laws, because of regional monopolies on the provision of internet service. So all of these neat divisions previously between libertarian positions and socialist positions are kind of breaking down. In the future, you may have a situation of such radical abundance that you wouldn't need to tax anyone in order to provide most goods for free to everybody. So the concept of a universal basic income through a federal land dividend is a precursor to some of these possibilities in the age of superabundance, in that there are a lot of unused resources right now. The federal government has a lot of land that it has appropriated over the decades that really is not being utilized in any way, shape, or form. But it could be, and it could be yielding revenues that can then be distributed to the general population. Now, those people wouldn't have, quote, earned that money by selling something or selling their labor, but nonetheless, they could put those resources to good use, and nobody has to be taxed in order to achieve that kind of solution. So is that libertarianism? Is that socialism? Is that something else? I would contend that that is something else, that you cannot really fit that concept, that proposal, into one of those 20th century terms. And essentially, a new vocabulary is needed in order to essentially correctly classify political positions and policy proposals going forward.
Right. And you consider yourself a libertarian, right?
I've identified as a libertarian, small L libertarian rather than large L libertarian, in that I wouldn't necessarily adopt the positions of the Libertarian Party or some of the candidates for the Libertarian Party. I think sometimes there is a fair amount of inconsistency there, but I am sympathetic to individual liberty. I am sympathetic to the notion that progress can best be achieved if people are free to innovate, if there's not a single overarching central plan, if there are not extensive restrictions on the scope of human activity or human freedom or what people can research or produce, or how people can make money.
Right. Were you a fan of Ron Paul when he was running? I was a big fan of Ron Paul.
I was. In fact, Ron Paul was not an establishment Republican. He was closer to a libertarian, but a more nuanced one. One who had a deep grounding in history and philosophy and economics, and didn't have this kind of more simplistic libertarianism that is sometimes encountered. The more simplistic libertarianism is everything that government does is bad, and anything that I as an individual want to do is automatically good. And that just doesn't work in the real world, because governments are also comprised of people. They're also comprised of individuals who have incentives, and one really needs to analyze in greater depth what those incentives are, what the specific policies are that a government is pursuing. And again, in a more technological age where some goods can be provided without any taxation, the old adages about, the government is just funded through, quote, theft from the people, no longer hold. What if a lot of things in life are actually free to provide? Then how does that position change? And likewise for individuals, we know that some activities can lengthen one's lifespan and some activities can shorten it. And I'm not in favor of restricting people's freedom to choose activities that shorten lifespans. But I think there's a difference between legality and morality. There's a difference between what you have a right to do and what is right for you to do. And from a legal standpoint, sure, I don't want to persecute someone because that person is making suboptimal choices. But I think there is a role in the culture for persuading people, influencing them in the right direction. If we have medicines that can materially improve the human lifespan, of course, people would be free not to use them. But we would want more people to use them. We would want more people to stay around for a longer period of time. And I would hope that there would be public advocacy campaigns for that goal, just as there are public advocacy campaigns against smoking cigarettes right now, or campaigns for promoting healthy living.
Yeah. I think it's completely evil that we're putting people in prison for having drug addictions and things like that, you know.
Right.
And
it doesn't help solve the drug addictions at all.
No. It's pretty bad. All right, let's get on. So, what do you think about this Greta Thunberg phenomena? And do you think we need we need a Greta Thunberg for transhumanism? Like, we need someone like that? Like, wouldn't that be cool?
Yes, I wish she were an advocate for transhumanism.
Yeah. Who's the Greta Thunberg that we need to find for transhumanism to lift our voice and bring it to the masses? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I don't have a specific individual in mind. I can give you some thoughts about characteristics, what that person would need to be or do in order to get that kind of media attention. So to attract the media,
maybe some child who read your book, Death is Wrong, will be the next Greta Thunberg for transhumanism.
Yes, I was going to say, to attract that kind of attention, it has to be obvious that the individual is extremely sincere and doesn't have any ulterior motives. Whether you like or hate Greta Thunberg, she is sincere about her views, and she tries to live by them. And I think people see this, and I think they, at the very least, have some reaction to it. They're drawn to it. They think it's either admirable or they think she's misguided, but nobody says she's cynical and manipulative and is just using this as a publicity stunt.
Right.
Some people have alleged that there are powerful interests behind her, but I'm not so sure that that is how those interests would operate in any event. So somebody like a child would be absolutely sincere. And also, the ideas of that person for activism and advocacy have to be stemming from what they want to do, not what some planner behind the scenes is suggesting that they do. But it actually has to be something that they originate themselves. So her school strike, for example.
That sincerity, people will see whether they're sincere or not.
Right.
You know? And she's passionate. I just love her passion.
Right. There's actually a person who is, in certain respects, similar to her, in many respects very different, who has profoundly affected another realm, not life extension, but music, but whom I admire even more, and that is Alma Deutscher. If you're familiar with her, she is a composer, a pianist, a violinist, who has been composing publicly and performing since she was 5, so she's a child prodigy, but she's 14 now. She's composed a piano concerto, a violin concerto, an opera, many shorter pieces, and all of these works are in a very refined, sophisticated classical style with melody, harmony, tonality, and she explicitly believes that music should be beautiful, that it shouldn't be shocking or jarring because there's enough of that out in the world. So she's challenging about 90 years of musical history and trying to get back to the great composers of the 18th and 19th century.
Cool.
And she has a tremendous following. And again, I think the reason for that is she's a child, she's clearly sincere, she's also highly talented, but she's not seen as being the pawn of cynical or nefarious interests.
Right. So is she a transhumanist? She's like
No,
into living forever?
I don't think she's familiar with transhumanism.
Okay. We need to get her on board then. We need to call her up and interview her and tell her.
I mean, if she ever writes music with transhumanist themes, music that can help the movement, I would be thrilled and delighted by that. But in this conversation, I'm using her as an example of a figure who is able to have that kind of influence by virtue of that earnestness. This is what the public is drawn toward because it is so unusual in our day and age. There is so much irony, cynicism, depression, skepticism in the contemporary world. And so many adults, when they talk about ideas, they do it with a certain resignation, or they do it in this kind of sardonic tone that suggests that they don't really expect the world to improve, even though the world is improving in many regards. They just they want to make fun of life, or they want to complain, or they just don't see that there's any hope, or they have very kind of short-term myopic motivations. And when someone is seen as having a higher set of ideals, that draws people in, whatever those ideals are. And one can disagree with the extent of alarm that Greta Thunberg is raising. I actually think humankind and the Earth have much better prospects, even with this kind of destructive climate change. I think there will be increased natural disasters in some parts of the world. There will be the need for some adaptation, but largely this is a problem that can be solved through technology. And it can also be solved by
She's a bit of an alarmist, a bit of a too extreme right there.
Right, and it's a question of how that alarm is interpreted. It could be interpreted in a good way if people associate the solution with the progress of technology. But if people follow more of a conventional left-wing environmentalist path, which would say, oh, you need to renounce technology, deindustrialize, go back to nature, and use less stuff, that's not going to help solve anything, because actually some of the more destructive forms of pollution are more primitive. In African countries where subsistence farmers still burn dung for fuel, that pollutes far more than any fossil fuel. And this is what people don't understand. More, quote, natural, more primitive doesn't mean better, either for human beings or for the environment. And the only way out of problems caused by pollution and climate change is forward, to develop better technologies.
I was just learning the other day of artificial trees that can sequester carbon out of the atmosphere, and like they're more powerful at doing that than real trees. Like that's a potential future technology. Of course, it's only in its very infancy right now, and they're not able to pump out these trees yet, but eventually that could be a big thing to clean up the environment.
Yes, indeed.
I really like Greta's quote, "Our house is on fire," and I actually use that quote for a meme, because we can relate that quote to like aging, right? It's like our house is on fire because over 100,000 people are dying every day from aging. Like that's the house on fire. Like we're literally dying, you know? So I like that type of thing. All right, now let's go on to the next thing. Okay, brain implants.
Yes.
A lot of transhumanists are gonna get brain implants. They're excited about it. How about you? Are you gonna get a brain implant, or do you have some concerns like me? I've got a lot of concerns about getting my brain implant.
Well, I never want to be part of the first experimental group to receive any kind of treatment. I'm far too risk averse for that, and I think those who are willing to do that are courageous, and they're performing a valuable service. Data can be gathered from their experience, but I want to be certain that these technologies are reasonably safe at the very least. You may never never have 100% safety, but I would like 99.99% safety at the very least. So I would like this technology to be out in the commercial market, widely available for people to use before I myself consider such an implant. Now, in the long-term future, in a few decades, if it becomes possible to, for instance, obtain a brain implant that allows one to download information into one's consciousness the way one downloads information onto a computer, that would be quite helpful.
Like in the Matrix, right? When he's downloading the information on how to fly a helicopter and kung fu, and right? Instantly learning something. That'd be cool.
Yes, and in the future, if there are brain augmentations, for instance, that increase the processing capabilities of the brain, or for instance, artificial neurons that can replace biological neurons, yes, I would be open to those in principle. I would want extensive data on safety to be available first.
Privacy is another concern, right? Maybe the company who puts the brain implant would have access to all your thoughts and your memories and everything, and that's a little freaky.
Yes, I think there should be a general principle with those technologies that only the individual has access and control unless permission is explicitly given. I think that should be the case for personal data as well. So you are the owner of your data. Whatever information about you that you choose to put out into the world, you should have the ability to direct how it may or may not be used. And if someone wants to use it for particular purposes, they can approach you, get your permission, either for free or you could ask them to pay you money. But right now, unfortunately, there's this kind of free-for-all with data where some entities think they can just resell other people's private information without compensating those individuals. And that is a concern to me, because that information could be used for purposes contrary to what that individual intended when he or she released it.
Absolutely. Another concern is I might be sounding like an alarmist now, but what if they can take over your free will and turn you into some Manchurian candidate and make you do things,
I think that would be very difficult, because it would require a kind of complete control, which you wouldn't be able to get if this were just one system integrated into the biological brain. More likely would be some sort of capability to remotely disable that system or cause it to act in a chaotic fashion, but not in a coordinated fashion where somebody is completely manipulating another individual. Take the analogy to computer hackers today. So a computer hacker can go in, steal some information, wreak havoc in the system. But I have never encountered a story of a hacker actually taking over a corporation, for instance, and beginning to run that corporation so that the actual management and employees had no control whatsoever. That has never happened, to my knowledge. A hacker could hold information hostage, a hacker could leak a bunch of information, a hacker could disrupt systems, sometimes in a fairly crippling manner, but not to the point where the hacker is suddenly the CEO of Amazon or the CEO of Microsoft.
Right. All right, so next question is, of all the different existential threats, okay, from AI to nuclear disaster to a pandemic, what do you think is the biggest danger? What are you most concerned about?
I think the biggest danger is the one that's right in front of us, and that's nuclear war.
Right.
Because many of the other posited existential risks are fairly speculative, but the risk of nuclear annihilation is very real. The United States, Russia, China, they have thousands of nuclear warheads right now.
Right.
And these nuclear warheads are not necessarily under the complete control of even the best intentioned politicians. And right now we cannot say that the politicians in charge even have the best intentions. If they did, they would be actively trying to disarm, and maybe there is a game theoretic piece to be considered there, in that if at all possible, one should try to disarm multilaterally so that there's not a risk of one country remaining with nuclear weapons that could try to bully the others. But right now, there's not even an attempt for multilateral disarmament. In fact, the US and Russia are engaged in an arms race right now, and once again are building up the nuclear stockpiles that Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan wisely drew down. So under Gorbachev and Reagan and then George H.W. Bush, actually the United States nuclear stockpile was reduced by about a factor of 6. And this is what a lot of people don't realize. These were Republican presidents in the United States who saw the risk of nuclear annihilation as being so severe that they wanted to see complete disarmament, and they wanted to find the fastest pathway toward doing so without leaving the US in a position where the Soviet Union and then Russia would have a nuclear arsenal while the US would not. So I believe there needs to be an urgent attempt to negotiate with both Russia and China for mutual nuclear disarmament. And this should be irrespective of any other geopolitical considerations. Whatever conflicts there are with Putin, whatever conflicts there are with the Chinese regime of Xi Jinping, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what is happening in Ukraine. It doesn't matter what is happening in Hong Kong or in Syria. The risk of humankind and indeed sentient life in the world being annihilated is far too great. And those other geopolitical disputes, they could be addressed in due time. They could be addressed through other means, through diplomacy. But to risk everything because of those kinds of controversies seems completely absurd and completely irrational. In 30 years, 40 years, most people will not remember what happened in Ukraine. Most people will not remember what happened in Hong Kong. But hopefully, people will be alive, and they will be grateful to be alive, and that the diplomatic efforts of our age led to peace and disarmament rather than a war that eliminated everyone.
Right. All right, so Elon Musk, he thinks there's a good chance we're living in a simulation. So what odds do you put on the idea that we're in a simulation? What do you think? I don't place much credence in that hypothesis. The most basic reason is Occam's razor. We really don't have any evidence to believe that this world isn't real, that there's some other underlying reality. If there is such evidence, show it to me. But right now, the simplest, most direct hypothesis that takes into account all of the available evidence is that this is it. This is the world that exists. And whether or not there's another world, we might as well treat this as the real one, because if we're mistaken, okay, there's another world to fall back to. It's the same principle of like why you don't bet on the afterlife, because you don't know there's an afterlife, so we don't know there's a simulation, right? It's very wishful thinking, essentially. I could see why believing in the simulation would give someone a lot of comfort, because they think, well, maybe they'll wake up in the real world and they get a second chance, you know? Yes,
especially for individuals who are non-religious, who don't have the religious concept of the afterlife.
I compare it to like the heaven for atheists, essentially. You know, very comforting. So what else? Elon Musk said also he doesn't want to live forever. Did you ever see that?
I have.
He said he's not a big fan of longevity, not a big proponent of longevity. I thought that was pretty crazy.
I'm not aware of his exact words. I know he's expressed some skepticism as well as a desire to die on Mars, which is rather foolhardy in my view. And that's unfortunate. I think it's a blind spot with him, just like his excessive fear of AI is another blind spot.
He's an alarmist with the AI.
I think he fails to recognize that technology can address and preempt a lot of these risks. think his intentions are in the right place when it comes to electric vehicles, when it comes to space travel, when it comes to improvements in infrastructure, new modes of transportation, like the Hyperloop. But I think he has not fully adopted the mindset of a transhumanist. So there are aspects of his activity and his worldview that definitely fit into a transhumanist framework. But I don't think he's thought about it in that sort of philosophically consistent way. I think he sees some significant potential for near-term progress, and in the areas that he's explored in depth, he has generally come to the right conclusions. But these other areas where he just makes these offhand pronouncements, he's not an expert in AI, and he's certainly not an expert in life extension research or in the philosophy of transhumanism. So he may come at these subjects from a kind of status quo bias just because he hasn't looked into them with the same rigor that he has looked into the probability of providing affordable electric vehicles or greatly reducing the cost of launching objects into space.
Right. Okay, I just thought of a potential candidate for our Greta Thunberg of transhumanism. Mm-hmm. Elon Musk's girlfriend, Grimes. Are you familiar with Grimes? She's a singer, pop singer, but she's a total transhumanist, wants to live forever, puts it in her lyrics.
Interesting.
Potentially.
Well, definitely something to look into.
All right, so quantum archaeology. Mm-hmm. Now, hypothetically, so people talk about quantum archaeology to me, and I'm very skeptical that it would actually bring consciousness back.
Yes.
Now, hypothetically, let's say you were to die, in the worst case scenario, but 1,000 years from now, they take a piece of your cell, they bring you back. Do you think that would actually bring your consciousness back? Because I don't think it would bring me back. That's why I don't put any stock in that as like, it would be a new me.
Right.
It wouldn't be me. It would be a copy of me in the future they could bring back, but it's like, would that be me? No, right?
I would agree that most likely would not be you. In fact, in 2010, I wrote an essay entitled, "How Can I Live Forever? What Does and Does Not Preserve the Self?" And I argue in that essay that bringing back someone who was previously dead, not just, say, dead clinically from a temporary cessation of the heartbeat that was later restarted, but dead for years or decades or centuries, and then a version was developed or restored that resembled that individual, that maybe even has the exact pattern of that individual's body and mind. That could be a plausible simulacrum of that person in the minds of other individuals. So if I were interacting with this future version of you, I might not know, if I didn't know that you had died, I might not know that it was a different I-ness.
It'd be good for you to be able to interact with my future copy. It wouldn't be good for me. I'd be dead, right?
Right.
So you hear that, Eternal Life fans? Don't put any stock in being resurrected in the future. Quantum archaeology. The message is don't die, right?
Yes. That is the principal objective that we should all have. How to avoid death in this world, in this present time, how to extend our biological lifespans to the greatest degree possible.
High five to that.
Indeed.
All right, so now just a few fun questions, and
Certainly.
then we're going to end it because we only have 9 minutes left on the battery life, so we're going to have some fun questions. Have you seen any good movies lately?
Oh.
And particularly, well, any good movie would do for this question, but any movies relating to eternal life or transhumanist themes that you like?
Well, a good movie that I think your audience would enjoy.
I'm a big movie person.
Is Immortality or Bust, which is Daniel Solinger's documentary about Zoltan Istvan's 2016 campaign. So it kind of follows.
I haven't even seen it. Am I in that at all? Is there
you might be.
There should be a scene of me in there at least, right?
Yes, you were there. So
I was there.
Watch the movie that includes yourself.
I should watch it. Okay. That's a documentary. That counts.
That's right.
Have you seen Ex Machina? I love it.
Yes, I've seen Ex Machina. Now, I do think at the end there is a kind of depressing message about what the consciousness and conscience of that kind of AI entity would produce. And I'm not going to spoil too much of the ending, but I think there could have been a different way to end it that would have provided more hope of a collaborative or tolerant coexistence between humans and AI.
It feeds right into Elon Musk's fears. He'd love it. He'd be like, yeah, see, I'm right. That's the future. But I love the tagline of that movie, which is there's nothing more human than the will to survive. That's just like, I quoted that so many times. It's just like, yeah, that's right. So I'm a big fan of characters in movies, and they inspire me. Willy Wonka, for one. I'm always talking about Willy Wonka. Is there any characters that inspire you that are just like, they could be a fictional character from a movie or anything like that really inspires you as a character? If you can't think of a fictional character, maybe a real person in history, but a fictional character preferably.
Interesting idea. Well, in terms of fictional characters, it's difficult to find a whole lot of fiction specifically about life extension, but there is a movie called The Man from Earth, which is kind of an interesting hypothetical exploration of what if there are some people who actually are already able to live indefinitely, but they're not indestructible, and they have to pretend to be people of ordinary lifespans in order to blend in and not attract persecution. So there's the main character in that film who essentially just poses as a school teacher for about 10 years, and then he has this conversation with a group of his friends, and it's in the course of this conversation that this idea is explored.
Ooh, I've often thought about that myself, like, hey, there could already be people living forever and we wouldn't know because they would be hiding from us. Because if you were living forever, would you just tell everyone and make that public? No, you'd probably hide it, right?
A similar story, it's a short novel by Robert Heinlein. It's called Methuselah's Children, and he wrote that in the 1950s. But Methuselah's Children is a story about essentially a voluntary selective breeding program from the 19th century, fictional one, that gradually led there to be a subpopulation of people who could live for hundreds of years. But they once again had to conceal it from the rest of the society. And this is a story about what happens when the rest of the society finds out, I believe in the 22nd century.
Wow. So the moral of that story is, I guess, just in case there is such a society out there, people living forever, we better make ourselves worthy so that they might adopt us into their society. Like they would pick us and be like, hey, let's let this guy live forever, right? He was a good moral person, right? Something to consider. All right. Last question. What's your opinion of my most inspirational character, which is Tinkerbell?
Tinkerbell.
Yeah, opinion on Tinkerbell.
Well, I only have good thoughts about Tinkerbell. If she wants to preserve people's youthfulness, then I'm all in favor.
All right, I love it. All right, it's been great interviewing you.
Likewise, great speaking with you, Roen.
See you guys later.
Farewell.
May you live forever.